Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to come, always a pleasure to come to Madison. So this discussion, as Lalita said in her introduction, is to talk about different aspects of this case that happened in December, in which a young woman and a male friend were coming back from the movies, were trying to find a bus, and unbeknownst to them, the bus that they entered was actually not a regular bus. Well, it was a regular bus, but it wasn't in service. And there were a group of young men, friends of the driver. They ended up raping her, all of them raping her, and beating the young man that she was with, and then beating her, and then taking an iron rod and sticking it up into her, and some really horrible, vicious attack in addition to the gang rape. And she died a couple of weeks later of her injuries. There were huge demonstrations, first organized by various women's groups, and then it became a more general protest with many men also in the crowds. Government had to, or felt they had to break it up. But eventually the government appointed a special committee to investigate the case and to recommend changes in the law or other kinds of measures that the government could take concerning rape and hopefully preventing this kind of thing from happening again. As Lalita said, it got a great deal of media attention, both in India, which Sana is going to talk about, and also abroad. And I'm not going to specifically discuss this, how it was treated in the media, but one of the aspects of the response to the media was focusing on the way that the Western media had treated this case. And more than one observer has criticized the Western media for writing as if this was something peculiar to India, and to quote one British journalist, using the event to simultaneously demonize Indian society, lionize our own society, and minimize the enormity of Western rape culture. So taking off from that quotation, I thought it might be a good idea to begin what I'm going to say by presenting some comparative statistics comparing rape, or what we know about rape, in India versus the United States. So here we have some comparative statistics. These are using United Nations figures. In the US last year, there were 32 rapes reported to these are all reported rapes, obviously, which doesn't include all rapes, but these are the ones that were reported. There were 32 per 100,000 population of the United States. By comparison, these are the 210 figures. In comparison, 1.8 rapes reported per 100,000 population in India. So if we can believe these figures, is the much, much higher percentage of rapes in the US than in India. In the US, however, the incidence of rape is falling, has been declining consistently over the last few decades. 60% decline since 1993, whereas in India the numbers are rising. However, the rate is rising rather slowly in India, from 1.6 to 1.8 per 100,000. And of course, during that period, though the number has increased significantly, the population has also been increasing, so therefore the rate is not so, rate of increase is not so striking. Now, what's the reason for this increase, whether it's an actual increase or whether it's an increase in the number of people reporting? We don't really know. Delhi has a reputation, or has been called the rape capital of India, because the figures are 572 in 2011, much higher than in any other city, even in Bombay. But this is less than half as many rapes as occurred in Chicago in the same year. And Chicago has only 1/5 of the population of Delhi. So if we, to put it in some perspective, I said estimated here. Interestingly, the FBI, puts on the web the official figures for reported rapes and every other crime for every city in the country. For Chicago, there's a blank and there's asterisk, and it says the reason we have no figures for Chicago is because Chicago does not, in their reporting, does not conform to FBI guidelines on how to report rape. I mean, and I didn't have time to look into exactly what the differences are. But this figure of 1,400 is based on, on a source, on another source, which did not say how they got it. So, but anyway, I think that is a reliable report. Now, there's issues, of course, about reporting. In neither country do most people who are raped report the fact. A U.S. survey of a sample of 40,000 women found that 54% of the women who were raped did not report it. We don't have comparable survey data for India, but I think it's fair to suspect that even a higher proportion of rapes are not reported in India. Though shame and dishonor of the victim is an issue in both societies, it is much more so in India. And this affects not only the victim, but the whole family. Honor killings are an extreme expression of this. Also, many victims have committed suicide. Even parents of victims sometimes kill themselves. And most victims, therefore, do not speak up about what happened to them. And not only because they're afraid of ostracism, won't get a husband, and so on, but also because they're afraid that when they go to the police won't take notice, they won't register the complaint, they will blame the woman for, it was her own fault, she was dressed immodestly, she shouldn't have been out at that hour of the night or whatever. And they'll question her morals, and they may even rape her themselves, because police rapes are not at all unheard of. Now, in the U.S., doctors, nurses, social workers, and so on are required by law to report a rape to the police if a victim comes in for treatment, but there are no such laws in India. And if medical personnel examine a rape victim and want to report it to the police, they have to get the woman's permission first. In the U.S., 61% of rapists are known to their victims. In India, the figures are 93%, again, of reported rapes. They are either family members or other relatives, neighbors, friends, whatever. In the U.S. until the 1970s, marital rape was not a crime, but since then all 50 states have criminalized rape by a husband, rape of a wife by her own husband. In India, they have still, even the most recent law does not criminalize marital rape unless the wife is under 15 years old. It might be fair, I think it's fair to assume that in the Indian context, at least, women are much less likely to report being raped by a relative or family member than they are to report being raped out in the streets by a stranger. Therefore, although the figures say 93, I mean, this is the official Indian figures, but from the Crime in India figures, they say 93% of rapes reported are by a relative or, a known person. It's probably much higher than that, in fact. So when we think about it comparatively, really the likelihood in India that a woman is going to be raped by a stranger is very, very small in comparison to the U.S. And, the reverse, of course, is also the case. Greater. One confounding figure that was reported by Flavia Agnes, although without giving any source, was that a third of reported rapes in India are actually reported by the parents of a girl who has eloped with her boyfriend. Now, exactly how this, fits in and how we would assess the significance of that is hard to tell. Okay. Other problem is conviction rates. In both countries, they are very low, but the available figures suggest that they are much lower in the U.S. than they are in India. Now, this may be because so few of the victims, of the rapists, are actually arrested and tried. And so once you get arrested and tried, then your chances of being convicted, at least according to the Indian figures, official figures, are much greater than what has been estimated for the U.S. Okay, so now I just wanted to talk about the law as it relates to rape. It first appeared in the Indian Penal Code, 1860. Section 375 deals with the definition of rape, and Section 376 deals with punishments. Rape is defined as it says up here, sexual intercourse with a woman against her will, without her consent, or if in fear of death, or if she believes the man is her husband, or if she's of unsound or mind or intoxicated, and she consents, that is considered without consent. If she's under 16, even if she consents, it's considered without her consent. Exception for marital rape, as I have said. Section 376 of punishment, those jail terms are quite short in the 1860 Penal Code, and a fine is sometimes an alternative. So not very harsh punishment. Up until 1980, there was no change in this law. But since 1980, there have been a whole series of reforms, and mostly instigated by representatives of India's very strong women's movement, usually in response to specific court decisions that either brought specific issues to the women's attention or made the government more receptive to long-standing demands of the women's movement, as in the case that we're discussing. The main issues that have arisen in relation to, the need for reforms over the years have been the issue of consent. How do you decide if the woman consented? Do you require that she have injuries all over her body, or is her word good enough? So on, that sort of issue. Then the issue of custodial rape, and I'll just talk about that. Gang rape, marital rape, something still not resolved. Police treatment of victims of rape, court treatment of victims, delays in the court procedure, medical treatment by doctors and hospitals, and the issue of the significance of the victim's past sexual history. How is this to be considered? So this was a case that aroused the first attempt to reform the law of rape. And it was an infamous case. a rape of a tribal girl, which then, to make things worse, the Supreme Court upheld the acquittal of the accused. And this caused a huge outcry. And because of that pressure, there was a law passed in 1983. Actually, did I put the law commission? No, I guess that slide got missed or something. But anyway, there was appointed a law commission to report in 1980 and suggest changes in not only in the Penal Code, but in the Code of Criminal Procedure and the Indian Evidence Act. And this led to the passage of the Criminal Law Amendment Act. And the main thrust of this law was to enhance the punishments for rape, on the one hand, and it also amended the Indian Evidence Act so as to make it an assumption of lack of consent in the case of gang rape, custodial rape, or rape of a pregnant woman. In 2000, there was another case that caused a change in the law, and this law, the Indian Evidence Amendment Act, says that the doctor has to examine a rape victim if she comes to be treated, whether or not she has reported it to the police. Because previously, the understanding of doctors was that they would only examine for rape if the police had given them an order to do so. In 2005, another law was passed specifying the legal requirements for how the examination should be carried out by a doctor. And this was the issue of whether it had to be, it said in the previous law that a female doctor should do the exam, but usually there wasn't a woman doctor available, and so then they wouldn't get examined. So this law says a man can do it if a woman's not available, and it doesn't have to be a government doctor if they're not available. In 2008, there was another act passed, an amendment of the Law of Criminal Procedure. And this one was in response to complaints about the way that police and the courts were treating the rape victims. Police wouldn't register the cases, or they wouldn't investigate, they wouldn't arrest the rapists. There were delays in the trials, and women were being questioned about their previous sexual experience, casting doubt on whether it was a genuine rape, or what was that guy who said in America? A legitimate rape. And then accused would get acquitted for lack of evidence. So this amendment introduces reforms in investigative procedures, allows in-camera trials, bars publication of trial proceedings in most situations, and introduced a victim compensation scheme, which, however, has really not been implemented up to now. Then in 2009, there was a decision by the High Court of Delhi that mandates a use of special sexual assault forensic evidence collection kit by medical personnel when they are gathering and preserving evidence of sexual assault. But this is only in effect in Delhi. Then we had this case, the case we're talking about. As a response to all the demonstrations and so on, the government appointed a 3-person committee headed by a former Chief Justice to investigate the case and recommend changes to the law, or other changes. And they finished this very rapidly, within 30 days. It's almost 700 pages. They took suggestions from a wide range of individuals and groups and government agencies, 80,000 submissions to the committee. But the police, although they were asked to do so, did not respond with any input. The report puts much of the blame for this kind of incident on the government, and especially on the police, for not protecting women against this kind of thing and for other reasons. I mean, 700 pages, I can't summarize it, but one of the things that they've done is, that they did in the report, is to propose a great refinement of the notion of consent. They also proposed much greater punishment if government personnel committed rape, or if they ignored it when their subordinates committed rape. And following that, the President of India issued this criminal law amendment ordinance, which was based very largely on the Varma report, but did not take all of the report's suggestions. One of the radical things that it did was, instead of talking about rape, it talks about sexual assault. It also makes the act gender neutral, so instead of saying a woman, it says a person, if any of these happen to a person. And in addition to rape, it includes acid attacks, voyeurism, disrobing a person, stalking, or trafficking. It also provides for the perpetrator to compensate the victim. It rejected the report's recommendation to try Army officers under civilian law, its recommendation to criminalize marital rape, rejected that. Its recommendation to ban sexual offenders from running for office. It rejected the recommendation to make military and police officers responsible for the offenses of their subordinates. It rejected the idea of making videography of the recording statement mandatory. It says it's optional. And it also differs from the report in allowing for the death penalty in cases that result in death or persistent coma. The committee had proposed longer jail terms, including life without parole, but did not accept the idea of a death penalty. Women's groups and others have consistently opposed making it a death penalty, largely because they feel it makes the convictions much harder to obtain. And this ordinance also, I should have said that before. It defines the act of sexual assault much more broadly, because in the 1860 Act, and this has been code, this has been continued, rape means penetration, penile penetration. What they have done in this ordinance is to say any kind of touching the penis, hand, or mouth to any part of the person's genitals, anus, or breast, or making the person touch one's own body parts. And so it's a very wide scope. Okay, well, so those are the statistical and legal aspects that I wanted to point out. And I think I better stop now. I had some other things, but this can go in the discussion about the issue of how to explain these kind of things. Why are these kind of things happening? What are the causes contributing? But we can talk about that, and I won't say it now. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much.
And if you have any questions, well, I guess after the other speakers, there'll be time for questions.
Great. So I thought that I'd just sort of throw out, in the interest of opening up this symposium to discussion and thoughts, some issues that I was thinking about while I was in Delhi, and then subsequently sort of following the news and the developments of this case. The very first thing that got me thinking was that, while this case was very horrific and certainly caught a lot of media attention internationally, it was neither the first or the only kind of rape in Delhi, in India, in the world, and even in its horrificness, with the iron rods and things that we used. Unfortunately, there was nothing, particularly special about this, and yet it seemed to have been the sort of straw that broke the camel's back. And that's what sort of resulted in these mass demonstrations in Delhi that I think were the trigger for the media sort of to really pick up on this, both in India as well as internationally. And the question that I had was, what was it? Was it that there was this simmering discontent over rapes that have been taking place, or was it something else? And in particular, the kind of discourse that emerged, during these protests and also amongst the national media was a very anti-government, anti-institution, anti-administration discourse. So it seemed as if the trigger was, of course, this case, but the resentment, of course, had to do with sort of gender issues and the instance of rape, but also this simmering discontent against the government in general, and that sort of frustration against the government and the police, that in fact in the form of this sort of opening up of the public sphere in Delhi goes back to the Anna Hazare anti-corruption cases, which really sort of changed, I think, the way in which especially the Delhi sort of middle class felt that it would express its own discontent in a very public way. So I thought that it's worth sort of connecting that demonstration, the public sphere that emerges, and where sort of this rape case comes in. Again, here the police and the government really mismanaged, as it had done with the Anna Hazare case. Delhi essentially turned into a complete police state. All the metro stations in and around, the main sort of central Delhi administrative areas were shut down. And again, it just sort of showed that the government was very uneasy with any kind of citizens' expression, and that again sort of created this cycle of more demonstrations and the media sort of coming in. And the entire discourse ended up being about justice, but no one really knew what justice meant. In this particular case, within just a few days, all the accused alleged accused sort of rapists had been found in all parts of Delhi and India and brought across to Delhi. So if it was just about justice, in this particular case, the person had been apprehended. Then the discourse became all about retribution, about sort of the death penalty. But mostly, what really seemed to capture people's imagination was this anti-politician rhetoric, and the politicians were not able to deal with this very well in terms of PR skills, said all sorts of things, and that became sort of the focus of this anger. And in a way, what got displaced was, the fact of the rape itself. So, and this kind of recurs in, I think, a lot of, from history, colonial history, in the treatment of women and these issues. And the media itself, I think, plays a very big role in this. I'm talking about the English and Hindi 24-hour news channels that position themselves as activists rather than just reporters. One particular news channel headed by Arnab Goswami, his every single 9 p.m. Show is about the nation wants to know, and it's all these politicians who are brought across. So he's kind of positioning himself as the nation, when in fact, the nation can't be, sort of conflated into just these protesters or him himself, but yet this was really the focus, and the way in which the demonstrations became larger and larger was through the use of that kind of conventional media, but also new media like Facebook, YouTube links that would be put up, and I think that also sort of leads to the international interest in this case. But as I said, no one was really talking about the rape itself. It was all about what would we do after the rape occurs in terms of punishment, in terms of changing laws and things. But I think the really uncomfortable issue in all of this is trying to understand rape itself, whether we want to do this culturally, socially, economically, politically, bring it together. Talk about whether there is a need to distinguish between different kinds of rapes, gang rape versus singular rape. As Sylvia was talking about, rapes of people who are known to the victim versus the unknown factor, and also, of course, state-sanctioned rapes versus sort of the more, everyday, opportunistic rapes. There's a burglary, a woman is sort of there, she gets raped. So I think that a lot of that ended up getting pushed away from discourse, and instead the entire focus was really about anti-government, anti-police, the courts, and this whole sort of talk about the rarest of the rare cases, is for death penalty or not, and there was very little focus on what society as a whole needs to do to actually change attitudes and mentalities. And to, you can only find a solution to rape if there is some discussion, some desire to understand what is the motivation behind these rapes. Again, in terms of the demonstrations, it was all about quick fix, about fast-tracking things. The kind of mob mentality, in a way, took over. And again, the media sort of is very much part of this. But interestingly enough, there was a total silence about rapes of minorities, particularly Muslims, during the Gujarat riots, state-sanctioned rapes in Kashmir and Manipur, which again, even the protesters weren't really talking about. There were some, women's activist groups, human rights groups that have been talking about this for many, many years now, but they weren't the ones who were getting any kind of attention at all. So there's, again, a sort of discomfort with, what is this really case representing and for whom? And then there was also a class discourse in terms of, who are these, the perpetrators of this? It was, a lot of young men from a very lower middle class background. They tended to be migrants, so that became the focus. Along with that discourse is, another discourse of, they aren't used to seeing women around who are dressed in a Western way, who are sort of walking around independently, who are in a way sort of urban and more middle class than them. But in fact, this particular girl herself came from a very similar background to her own, to the people who had been raping her. Her father was, just a sort of labor worker in the Delhi airport. He had to sell a lot of his rural agricultural land to, have her educated. So I think that, in a way, the entire class dimension is very interesting and worth unpacking a little bit. And then lastly, in terms of how groups, such as this, and also sort of activist groups in India, really, there isn't a consensus over what the issues were and therefore what the solution is. Everyone sort of wants a solution, but, the big dilemma is this particular case going to be treated as a particular rarest of the rare case, or is it going to really stand in for something more universal? And there's very little agreement on that. I mean, even just yesterday, I shared with the panelists here, a blog by Nivedita Menon, who's one of the big sort of women's rights activists in India, who's very upset over meeting symposiums like this, where she says this is just a question of the same old attitude where brown women have to be saved by brown men, by the white savior, and there's a kind of discomfort with that. And again, politics is local. If the solution to this, in terms of these legal cases, it's going to be all about local, well then, what is the point of what we are doing here as well? So I thought that that's also something worth just sort of throwing out, and to get all of your thoughts on it.
Okay, thank you very much, Sanad. Could you like to respond, Sylvia?
No, I think that, what she said, I agree very much with it. I would like to say about the last thing, that your last remark about Nivedita Menon's, I think maybe she was also talking about discussions like this, but I think mainly what she was talking about and objecting to was the people at Harvard proposing an actual project to advise Indians about what to do. So but you're right. I mean, even a discussion would probably come under her eagle eye, but I think it was the other aspect of it that was mainly her objection.
So just for the record, we're not aiming to come up with advice or recommendations at the end of this session. We're just really talking about our responses and the things that we can perhaps learn from what is going on and how that can inform our own thinking and our lives. So I'd like to open it up. I would urge you to be short. There's a lot of people here, and to get to your point quickly. We have some legal experts here. Yes, would you like to start?
I'm Dr. Sharda from India. Well, after this rape issue, there was another rape issue of a girl known as Chanchal. And that girl, 19-year-old girl, there were a few people who had been making sexual advances to her. And one day they break open inside their house at Patna. This happened at Patna. And then they poured acid on her and also on her 15-year-old sister. And that girl's case has not received the media attention as the Delhi rape case has taken. Of course, when the Delhi rape issue took place, I was very uncomfortable with Arundhati Roy's statement that all this attention is because the girl belongs to a middle class or a forward community, and this other things being the rapes of the lesser lower castes in India or issues like that. A rape is a rape. Okay, a rape is a rape, horrendous it may be. But why do you think that this particular case had received so much of sensation and the others have not?
Thank you. Any thoughts on that?
Well, that is the big question, right? And that's why the way in which I think that location does matter. I think that, the media does play a role in this. What's going on in Delhi, especially central Delhi, places like Basant Vihar and Munirka where this happened, is something that, the sort of national media picks up on, and then it sort of has a trigger effect. And Patna, again, the discourse in Delhi is, well, Bihar is the Wild West in any case. These things happened, and in a way, I think Arundhati Roy was quite right in saying that, well, people seem to only be getting interested when they can identify in some way, and put themselves in the position of, well, it could have been me or someone that I know. Now, that doesn't delegitimize the entire, I think that there were very real feelings being expressed there, and resentment and grievances, but, I do think that there is that dynamic that played a role, and, the question is whose responsibility is it then to make even the Patna case get as much attention. And as I said, I think what happened in this was that the fact of a rape is a rape. It doesn't matter who, what, where, which context. That got completely sort of sidelined in the discourse that took over instead.
Only yesterday I received a video clipping of that Chanchal's mother.
Mm-hmm.
She has sent a video clipping. Of course, somebody should have done it on her behalf.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and it was very painful to see that girl. But the girl, although she is so bruised with acid all over her body, she still resolved, okay, to get justice.
Mm-hmm.
That needs to be appreciated.
I think that just to bring that question a little bit around to another issue that I think is important, is that the reactions to it seem to be, people are trying to explain it, and they seem to be divided into two broad, categories. I mean, there are those who are saying, well, this is just, rape, this case, and then rape in general is just part of a much larger problem of violence against women, which occurs in many different forms and is related to, a long-standing Indian culture, patriarchal, so on, denigration of women, unequal treatment of boys and girls when they're growing up, and so on. So, and people who are thinking along those lines are saying, well, the cure for this, or not the cure, but what we should do in response to this, we women, we should get out there more. We should make ourselves felt in public space. We should wear what we want. We shouldn't, bow to all these restrictions, because this other trend is to blame it on westernization, globalization. We never had rapes in India before. This is a recent development, and it's happened because of Western influence, films, TV, video, and all of these global, this global impact. And over there in the West, they're raping people right and left, and now it's coming over here. So many of these activist women are saying, let's not bow down to that. Let's not accept that being raped is a shameful thing. It's not the rapee's fault. And why should we consider the rapist a living corpse? The expression, zinda lash. We should.
The victim.
What?
The victim should not be considered
The victim.
right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I said the rapee. Well.
Oh, I thought you said the rapist.
No,
Sorry.
no.
I'm confused.
I guess rapee isn't really a word. But anyway, so I think this also, is related, maybe a little peripherally to your question.
Kat.
Yeah, I guess I have two things that I would enjoy hearing any of you speak to, and the first is the role of the conversation on urban versus rural. That is very much a part of how Indian society is talking about both this case and the way in which people are moving and populations are moving in general, because it seems that it goes with this sense of like the city is the dangerous place, and
Yeah.
if you don't know everyone, it's the dangerous place. And I think particularly, Sylvia, with the way in which the statistics on whether you know your rapist
Yes.
go with this, they don't exactly match the conversation that's going on
Not at all.
around urbanization. And then the second thing I would enjoy hearing about is the role of violence in both how this rape was talked about in the media, but then how protesters are talking about it, because there's been, one of the readings you sent out was about the way in which protesters are talking about killing rapists and how
Right.
they want really horrible, violent things to happen to rapists. And
rapists.
so this idea of where violence and what violence can or cannot do fits into this conversation.
Good point. Nobody.
Yeah, all right. Any other observations at this point? Mark?
Yeah. What strikes me is how much the conversation is about when people say, what can we do about this? The first thing the Verma Committee says is, we need a lot of new rules.
Right.
And how relatively little attention is placed on institutions that are supposed to enact these rules. Say, well, what is it? I mean, after all, these things, there have been rules, laws against these things all along. You could say, well, they're not ideal in the way they're formulated, and they could be stronger and so forth, but nevertheless, they've been there, and we know that something has kept them from being enforced and institutionalized in a regular way. And then the question is, are those things that have prevented those laws from working going away just because we have some new, quote, stronger laws? And it seems to me that if we just take the police, we say, okay, now what incentives are we creating for the police to enforce these new laws? It seems to me that you have to sort of dig in at this level and talk about what makes laws work or not. And my fear is that we're really tapping into something that's much broader than rape or sexual harassment and so forth. That and that is a very pervasive kind of disconnect between legal regulation and what people feel they have to do or are permitted to do in the, so I think there's a kind of a general problem of legal effectiveness at the kind of grassroots level here, that this is one aspect of.
Yeah, I think that, it's a very general tendency in all of the campaigns over the years dealing with different kinds of violence against women. The women's movement itself has focused mainly upon changing the law or putting in new laws. And your question is very, very appropriate. But another aspect of it is, even if these laws were effectively instituted, would that reduce the incidence of rape or of these other things? I don't know all this literature, but there certainly have been studies showing that the death penalty doesn't discourage people from murder, and I'm sure that it would be true of many of these other things too. And certainly the whole situation of the police and these guys,
Yeah,
how
and
are you gonna make them-
suppose you said, well, we're really going to reward the police for apprehending rapists.
Yeah. They'll go out and grab anybody.
We'd end up with a lot of false cases.
Absolutely.
You know, we might end up with some good ones as well, but
Yeah.
we know the cost of that would be
That's right.
a lot of false cases.
Yeah.
So it's a
I know,
really
yeah.
tricky business, it seems to
It's
be, when you have this kind of legal system that at the ground level is very dependent on the kind of, let's say, kind of private inputs. And where you don't really have, at least not uniformly, a kind of tradition of sort of public, of a police force that's pursuing publicly announced goals.
Right.
You know, so suggesting that at the enforcement level, it's a much bigger problem than
Yeah.
rape.
I want to speak to some of the things that Kat pointed out, and then we'll have some more questions. This idea of the urban versus rural, I think this whole debate, the thing that perhaps gets me thinking the most is the way that it essentializes certain ideas once again. And for me, for instance, the way that she was referred to as nearby as fearless already comes into that, because it somehow, I know that you had an issue with it, I don't know if we're on the same page. To me, it feels it gives her kind of an agency that she clearly did not have. And then her kind of, this kind of halo that's bestowed on her. I mean, yes, it was horrific. I mean, clearly this, but this idea that rape is worse than death, I think, essentializes a woman's sexuality into something that, and most of us would probably disagree with that statement. And you know, we should have the space to say that, and there seems to be no forum for that. And then this idea that you know, we can package it. Well, it's not going to happen to us because, you know, the city is a dangerous place, and I think statistically worldwide, the home is by far the most dangerous place for any woman, anywhere. And so that I do feel that the way that the protest went, and then to speak to your violence point, Kat, the violence of the protest and the demands for the death penalty, I think, was for many of us extremely uncomfortable. By the sheer emotionalism of it, but also that it's just not a very good demand. I think most of us would say, as Sylvia pointed out, if that's the bar you set, then your conviction rate is going to drop. And then another thing I read that I hadn't thought about is that if the penalty for rape and murder is the same, then you might as well kill your victim and hope you're going to get away with it because the evidence is gone. And so these very emotional demands are not very well thought through when you bring them down to the level that Mark Galanter is talking about. How are you actually going to enforce this? What are we actually going to do with this? So I feel that we're trying to wade through this kind of morass of different demands and different angles, and to also throw this out there, something we talked about last night, this question about the minor, whether he was a minor or not. And I think for many of us, you know, if the kid's almost 18 and he's done this horrific thing, then I think many of us would say, well, you know, so what? You know, let's try him as if he were not a minor because he's old enough. And apparently, children's rights activist groups are very much against this, and you can see why, because once you start lowering that age, then where do you stop that? And so I think there's so many different issues that need to be unpacked, and I think we're still really only at that top level of just looking at what the media has done with it, and it needs to go so much deeper than that. There was, and then John, I've got you as well. Go ahead.
Okay. Is this a cultural issue which I find it almost every time when there is a news about rape, that people also start blaming the girl or woman that they invite rape, they induce rape, they excite it. This is more, I am finding culturally happening more in India than in the Western country. Here we don't hear that much of thing that the girls or women invite the rapes or excite on, but incidentally, I was here in 1970 when there was a news that the judge here had then commented that actually the girls, women themselves are responsible for who are inviting the rape. So this thing, I think it is not as much in the Western countries in Europe as it is in the Eastern countries like India.
That is taken.
Hang on, John, did you want to respond to this, Shagun, or can we, because John was first? All right, John and then Shagun.
I
Go
just
ahead.
wanted to ask quickly about the political side of this, how it's being engineered as Congress's debacle, as if rape never happened when any other party was in power. I just wanted to hear a little bit about that. So to what extent is this a PR failure for the Congress Party, and how is it being spun by other parties?
Okay, Shagun?
Okay. Oh, no, I was just going to talk about sort of Western attitudes to women. Sort of, I mean, I think that's still a very prevailing attitude here in America, that a woman is asking for it. People might not say it out loud, but they'll say things, oh, well, she shouldn't have been out that late at night. She shouldn't have been dressed like that, you know. So perhaps it's more subtle, but I feel that it still exists. And
I think there's something very uncomfortable, the randomness of violence against women, and I think apart from the judgment, which of course is there as well, just a clear moral judgment, there's also a way that we all try and make ourselves feel that this is not going to happen to us, because as long as there's kind of a code of rules that you follow, that we're going to be okay, and even though we know that this is clearly not true, I think we all try and make our lives livable that way. I think that is part of it as well.
Yeah. I can actually think of two instances, the Dominique Strauss-Kahn case and the Duke lacrosse team case from a few years ago, because one woman, with the DSK particular case, it didn't really come to anything because she had lied about her immigration status. That is very much an indictment on the character, which has nothing to do with the actual incident that was being tried, but it got dismissed. And with the Duke lacrosse case, because she was a stripper, and again, ultimately they did sort of dismiss the case, but the entire discourse that I remember in the media was, well, probably not, she kind of, was there, would these Duke undergrad students really have done that? Maybe it was just an instant of not getting enough money that she had asked for and things like that. So I think that, of course, cultural discourse is different from locality to locality, but I think that blame the victim is very much part of any kind of dealing with, in any kind of patriarchal societies. It just sort of translates and articulates itself in different ways. But John, about that question of the political side, I think you're absolutely right, and partly why, that's why I kind of link it up with the Anna Hazare protests as well. Yes, it was a huge PR failure on the side, on the part of the Congress, and how they, completely mismanaged this entire thing. But no one is talking about Narendra Modi, who oversaw the Gujarat riots, where there were these, horrific cases of rape against Muslim women in Kashmir, the Indian Army that both the BJP and the Congress sanctioned in Manipur again. But what did happen with the demonstrations at one point was that Baba Ramdev's people sort of joined in, and in fact ironically turned a non-violent protest pretty violent, and women who had been there sort of demonstrating said that they were touched in inappropriate ways and things. So it was sort of taken over for a moment, and that's when the president's son made that remark about, these women aren't really students, activists is dented and painted women. I mean, what he was trying to say is that it's become this politicized thing. But of course, again, the focus became, his particular use of the phrase, but I think that there is a big political side to it as well.
There's a number of people in the room who are not perhaps South Asia specialists, new faces. I would encourage you to also feel that you're able to contribute to this discussion, even if you have not been yet.
I would just like to point out the point you made where it's a very collective point of view where it's very shameful, a lot more shameful in India to be raped, and so that's why sometimes it isn't reported, and it can have a greater effect on the person, and they may commit suicide, or that the family members may be greatly affected by it. So kind of like a progression towards more therapeutic aspects of it for rape victims or things like that, where beyond the doctor's office where they examine to see if they were raped, if they can get some kind of, at least in that day, some kind of session of counseling to let them know that this isn't a blame the victim situation, and just to give them more context so that instead of internalizing it and not dealing with it, they can move forward, hopefully, and so can their family.
Yeah. Well, I was, I mean, I have not read the entire Varna report, which has all those pages. I know you've read more of it. Do they say much at all, aside from, you know, the blame on the government and suggesting new laws and so on? Do they address issues of how to change society's attitudes, or, you know, socialize people differently, or anything? I mean, do they include that in there or not? Because that seems to me is the only way, is if you have, I mean, if this is the reason for it, for rape being so common, although again, as I pointed out, it's not really that as common as it is here, but as common as it is, I mean, if those are the reasons for it, I would expect them to address that.
I didn't see a lot focused on kind of social change, but I certainly saw, outside of the government report, I saw a lot of activity on that front. Things like this 1 Billion Rising movement. I don't know if any of you saw the flash mob sort of protest dances all around the world, actually, on Valentine's Day. And they've got some more things coming. That's for me is a very
in India, you mean?
In India and internationally.
But in response to this issue.
In response to this issue. So it seems to me like a lot is happening on the front of larger cultural change, but I think it's harder in a sense for a group like the Varna Report to really put their finger on particular things that can be done. So I think they, in a sense, focusing on government institutions is easier. But
Well,
the
that may
NGOs
have
are
been
certainly
their charge
working on it.
also.
Yeah.
Well, this must be a funding issue there. I mean, there's no money for anything health related. So the idea that you know, who's going to pay for that? So that is going to be one of the question there. And then nuclear. Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, it's just, I wonder if people would agree with me on this, but my sense is that there's still quite a stigma attached to counseling in India. It seems like it's socially quite unacceptable to go for psychiatric or psychological professional help. So I think it's a good idea, Hillary, that you suggested, but I wonder culturally how and socially how accepted it would be.
Well, I just want to make 2-3 points of questions, and there are like hundreds of points and questions that have been buzzing in my head ever since I've been here for the last hour. One is, so I was thinking as to why rape victims have not been getting justice in India, and I know that that's true for like all many countries, but I thought that was primarily because of 2 reasons, and there are hundreds of reasons. One is that India has been traditionally a patriarchal society and all that. And the second reason is that any criminal is not afraid of being caught and being punished in India, as a generalization. But I feel that that's not true for example, the US, right? The US has traditionally not been a patriarchal society. You may argue that there are instances where you could sort of say that it indeed has been, but for example, for many years here, women have been independent financially, professionally, and all that. And I know there are exceptions and you can argue against it, but relatively speaking, US is not as patriarchal as India. Also here, there is the fear of law, right? You jump a traffic signal, you know that you're going to be caught. And for many of us who have been to India, we know that's definitely not true in India. So even for a small crime, breaking the rule, you know that there's someone who will catch you and who will punish you. There's some sort of punishment. So that was one question as to why, in spite of not being as patriarchal and there being a rule of law, there being a fear of law, it's still, I mean, the numbers just are completely opposite, right, to what you would think. So that was one question, and I would be happy to hear your response and thoughts. The second question is, it just seems like there is no hard solution to making sure that rapes don't occur in the future. You could punish rapists, you could put them to death, you could change the law, but there doesn't seem to be a hard, concrete solution. And I feel that probably a soft revolution, so to speak, could lead to a world in the next 10, 20 years where instances of rape would just reduce. There could be many sort of initiatives in this softer revolution, but I don't know if anyone has ever thought of that, being like a more assuring change, rather than just thinking about okay, what laws could we improve, how could we improve the wording of these laws and things like that. Of course, it has to do with implementation of justice and how it's enforced.
Okay, I think I'll stop you there because
Okay.
we're already running over and there's, and then, yeah, all right.
Did it have any effect on the Armed Forces Special Protection Act?
No.
Any move? Because there was some.
The president, I think the
At least
Justice
after the Justice
Vermont
Vermont
Committee,
Committee.
included it, but it was removed immediately in the final version. And none of the protesters were taking up that issue at all. I mean, Manipur and Kashmir are pretty far away from Delhi, so it's not. And I think that's very much the issue, right? Is any rape? Or is there a need then, if we are thinking in terms of solutions, to distinguish between rapes, and is it only possible to have laws where rape is by an unknown, in this instance, versus what's going on, in those areas or within the household. And, it's true that, the legal system certainly, in terms of both the laws but also the implementation, have a lot of space for reform. But it's kind of getting the state in even further into people's everyday lives, as the sort of main way in which society will change. I don't know that the state has ever been able to do that anywhere in the world, and certainly in India, given that the entire protest was about being anti-state, it kind of shoots itself in the foot by ultimately demanding that the state intervene even more. The cases that even Sylvia talked about, it's in police state. The very first case about the rape of the girl in the police station. 2 or 3 years ago, the president's bodyguards raped a young schoolgirl in the lawns of the president's, of Rashtrapati Bhavan, so giving the state more power, again, but then do we distinguish between state-sanctioned rape and have a separate conversation about that versus these other rapes? And, I don't know, I'm not a feminist scholar, I don't know the literature, but I'm interested in hearing what others think.
I do think that in some way, what you're basically asking is how can we change everybody's mindset is your question. So obviously not going to solve that in the next 5 minutes. But I think having a very serious discourse about state-sanctioned rape would be a good starting point, because there does seem to be double standards, and it's okay for some and not okay for others. I personally was not happy when rape was officially pronounced to be a war crime. I feel it puts it in an area where I'm not comfortable with it being, and it's very complicated. But I think sometimes progress is made that for many of us perhaps is not such good progress, or it gives a message that may be misinterpreted. So I feel that there is, rather than looking at it from this very kind of, how do you change, that person, there is something so much bigger to be discussed. And of course, then we end up having to dismantle patriarchy altogether. So again, that's not going to happen soon. But looking at what kind of messages are given from the kind of state and from the top down, I think would be not an unreasonable starting point for a kind of discussion to how you change people's mindset, because that's really what you were asking. So easy. John.
I find it refreshing, just to kind of side note, that the language has been changed, the gendering of the language has been changed.
Yes.
To not only include rape of children, possibly, but also homosexual rape. And I wonder about whether other things happening in India about, the larger presence of or visibility of homosexuality had anything to do with that. I'm not sure. Also, there was a few weeks back, maybe about maybe 2 months ago or so, there was a op-ed in the New York Times, I think, that was talking about this issue of patriarchy. That it was damning of people in the West saying that it has to do with the predatory Indian male. And so that particular op-ed wanted to shift attention to economics. I don't think we can toss out patriarchy that easily,
Right.
but there's also a way that patriarchy can be a cop-out in the way that op-ed wants to unveil that, it's just something about Indian culture, and there's no way to change that. Indian culture is this monolithic patriarchal thing, and it's kind of, the problem is endemic, and there's nothing we can do about it. And I want to include culture in the conversation in a more helpful way that says that, yes, historically speaking, Indian culture has been patriarchal, but it's not as simple as that, and it's not as monolithic as all that.
Well, and I think also the patriarchy versus economic, poverty is patriarchal, so I feel you can't really separate those things out either, and so then, but then what are we really talking about, so.
Just to address the first of your 2 points, because I think people addressed the second one pretty well, is, and this is looking at it more from an econometric standpoint and statistics, and what they say to me, is that if you're saying that a high 90% are familiar to the victim, and a huge number of the accused rapists are convicted, what that means to me is that the people who are coming forward and reporting these cases are much more what I would consider unavoidable to prosecute, right? As somebody close to the family that they're gonna have to live with, and they can't just look the other way. And so unless you assume that our police in Chicago are far inferior to India's, and that our legal system is far inferior to India's, then the only thing, you can't look at those numbers and not say that the problem is reporting, where people aren't coming forward unless it's unavoidable.
Right.
And so when you look at the social, the economic, it has to be a part of the fact that it's not socially acceptable yet to come forward. You don't feel like you're going to get the support that you need unless you have to come forward.
Right.
And so, looking at American society in the last 20 years, we have, this is elementary, but you have Law and Order SVU. You have what was the other one with, you have these TV shows that have shown America that if you come forward, if you're a victim, you'll be supported.
Right.
And I don't know enough about India to talk about it that way, but I just feel like in America we've made great strides for people who are victims to feel like it's okay to admit that you're a victim.
Yeah, but also shows that are kind of voyeuristic in a way as well. I mean, the focus on just the bodies and the details, so it's true, and I get your point, but again, it sort of goes back to that point of the state being the protector, and again, the entire discourse is about what happens afterwards, when in fact, it seems as if, a stricter law is not preventing rape at all, right? Yes, the rapists are getting away with it more in India, and perhaps, and that's why these legal reforms are important and shouldn't be dismissed. But that's not the end of the story at all. But what these news channels are doing is exactly that kind of thing, right? The reporter, citizen activist who's trying to play that role to get people out there, and certainly there's a little more attention. But then as was pointed out, there's another case in Patna. No one really cares about that. It gets a little column space.
I just also want to point out for the sort of American perspective, yes, we've made a lot of strides in American society in terms of saying it's okay to come forward about rape, but if anyone remembers a while back the testament by the Amherst student, the college student, very sort of privileged background, college student, the entire college system supposedly conspired, I can't think of a better word right now, to sort of say, no, this didn't happen on our campus. And, she was, privileged, white, etc. I mean, Law and Order, TV shows, etc., they don't quite reach out or resonate with, for example, lower income, poverty-stricken areas of the U.S., minority communities, where this is still a huge problem, and people don't have the time, don't have the money, don't have faith in the system to come forward about these things. So I think in that sense, we still have a huge problem, but perhaps in a different way from India.
Yeah, and I certainly don't want to say that we have found the solution.
Yeah.
I just, it's a very difficult path to go down, and that's obviously still.
But your basic point that the reporting needs to be unavoidable, I think, is that's the issue, right? When people need to feel that they can report it, and that then nothing bad will happen to them.
And that the police will investigate the hard cases, not just the easy ones that they can do the other way.
Yes.
One quick question.
Sure.
We're talking about why rape happens, and what you said is very true, that one can't change the attitude of people on a short-term basis. It's going to take time. But on the other hand, when we are talking about making amendments to laws and making stricter rules, I wanted to know what is the lawmakers' take on something closer to torture, which is not death penalty, which a criminal would be really scared of. Because I really don't know much about this field, so as a layman, I'm asking this question. Why the criminal may not be scared of death, but what if you do something to torture the criminal and then leave him, like, not let him die? I just
I
wanted
think I'll
to.
leave that one to our legal experts here. Yes, Mitra, go for it.
My understanding in the Indian context is really that the problem is, and this is looking at what Mark said, enforcement. So the laws, and I think the laws that the changes that have been made through this most recent ordinance on the Verma Committee's recommendations sound like a step forward, but still fundamentally it seemed to me the problem was not the law in the books. The problem was that the law in the books is not being enforced. So as much as there are huge problems, I mean, scholars have been trying to prove for a really long time that severity of punishment actually has a deterrent effect, and they haven't really been successful in that. But in India specifically, it seems to me that criminal law is, it's simply not. It's the police are not. It's not being properly enforced.
But there is
So-
plenty of torture. That is, it's, what was that? The movie about the Bombay.
Black Friday?
What?
Slumdog Millionaire?
No, the one where he wins the.
Yeah,
Oh,
Slumdog
Slumdog Millionaire.
If you recall the police scenes in that, and it seemed to me that was pretty, from my guess would be pretty realistic, that, you know, at least as far as lower class Indians go, torture is a reality in the police setting, and that I'm not sure there's anything, you know, that is, there's no reason to think that legitimating it would produce any useful results.
And we actually, some of the defendants in this actual case have been tortured, we think, by the police. Yeah, unsurprisingly, yeah.
Yes.
Well, even middle class Indians are victimized by police torture. Whoever has lesser access to money and lesser access to power, they will be tortured.
Well, yes, all right.
I just
Final
wanted to tie into
statement.
Richa's point about like a realistic point on law, like a Holmes' point of view on law, where she made the point where it's not so much about the legitimization of it, but of the enforcement of it. Whereas if you look at law as a bad man, as Holmes would say, where you're more interested in reaping the rewards, and if it's not strictly enforced, you're not so concerned with it. So if the threat of sanction isn't there, there's not as much of, you know, you're not, like, you're more induced to speeding because you're running the risk and you're not always going to get pulled over the numerous times that you do it. So you're reaping the rewards in a way because you're not so threatened by the sanction if it's not as actively enforced.
Well, thank you all. Thank you for those that stayed till the end. and thank you all for being here. And thank you very much to Sylvia Vatuk and Sam Ayer for hosting it.
Those of you who spoke who are still here, it would be appreciated if you signed a release form.
Yeah, I think that would be good to have. Yeah.